All right, welcome back everybody from the break. I won't offer a long introduction because Hanna was introduced to most of you yesterday, but since there are a few new people in the room at Capacity Crowd this morning, let me just say that as of September 1st, Dr. Hanna Notte will be director of, screwed this up already, yesterday, Eurasian...
Director for Eurasia, yes.
Director for Eurasia, not for Eurasian Studies, but Director for Eurasia at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies. And Hanna is a colleague of mine at CSIS, a senior non-resident associate. And I think everybody knows yesterday or recalls yesterday's presentation on the details of Russian foreign policy in the Middle East, broadly construed, and in the South Caucasus. And now we will, in a sense, widen the lens and look at Russian statecraft and foreign policy more broadly. So with that, Hanna, the floor is yours. Same structure as yesterday, roughly 45 minutes, and then we'll go to discussion.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael. So this lecture today, I thought the purpose would be to really zoom out and ask how Russia's global foreign policy has changed with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine last February. And this is sort of, for me as well, work in progress still. I've tried to sort of structure my thoughts about what's actually changed and what perhaps has stayed the same. I use the term statecraft, foreign statecraft, to basically mean Russia's art of projecting power abroad through various means, whether that's economic, in the information space, military, political, diplomatic. And the two concepts that I'm working with are acceleration and adaptation. And I'll briefly tell you what I mean by that. And then I want to go through these different areas on a global scale. By acceleration, I really mean Russia doing more of what it already did before this war. So a continuation of an extant strategy, a continuation of previous trends in Russia's foreign policy, whether that's in the strengthening of Russia's relations with non-Western countries, whether that's some of Russia's strategies in multilateral institutions. And by adaptation, I mean genuine change. The Russian state adapting to unforeseen circumstances, engaging in things that are genuinely new abroad, to really ask what's new in what Russia is doing in its global foreign policy, and what is merely a continuation or, as I say, acceleration of previous trends. And so I want to go through these different areas, and I've sort of listed what I see as the major changes, but I'll also be very curious to hear feedback on this, because this is sort of a crystallization of an emerging book project of mine about Russia's foreign policy since the invasion of Ukraine. And I'll be very curious to hear from you what I might have missed. So yeah, let's go through these different areas. So first of all, I think, of course, the economic adaptation in Russia's foreign statecraft has been quite instrumental to Russia being able to continue this war. There's different areas I want to go through that I see as most significant here. The first is what I call the oil lifeline, or Russia's ability to continue to export hydrocarbons to different parts of the world after the introduction of Western sanctions against Russia. I think China is most noteworthy here. By the first quarter of 2023, Russian oil exports to China had risen by over 30% compared to the previous year. Russia has now managed to overtake Saudi Arabia as China's top oil supplier. Russia has also sold a record amount of oil to India since the invasion of Ukraine. I think Indian imports jumped like tenfold in 2022. And importantly, the Indians were also willing to pay for Russian oil in non-dollar currencies, like in the Emirati dirham and then also the Russian ruble. There's also sort of new deals being made. So in early June, Pakistan said that a first cargo of discounted Russian crude arrived at the port of Karachi under a new deal that was struck between Moscow and Islamabad. Russia has also exported more diesel products to states like Brazil and Saudi Arabia. The next category is what I call big business deals abroad. And yesterday in the lecture on the Middle East, I was arguing that If we leave sort of Russian oil and gas exports aside, there's sort of few areas in which Russia is really competitive as an exporter. One is arms sales and one is civilian nuclear technology. And I think Rosatom is really interesting to look at because Rosatom has been able to thrive still since February of last year. There was a good study by RUSI, which is a think tank in London earlier this year, that looked at Rosatom's dealings over 1 year since the invasion of Ukraine. And I think, while some countries, especially in Europe, of course Ukraine, but also the Czech Republic and Bulgaria have really tried to diversify away from Rosatom. Other countries have actually increased their imports of nuclear-related goods from Rosatom. China, Hungary, Turkey, India are all important countries to mention here. And it's not just nuclear power plants that Rosatom is constructing. And I mentioned also the Akuyu plant in Turkey yesterday and the El Dabaa plant in Egypt, but it's also fuel elements, parts of reactors, and enriched uranium. It's just that Russia is so important in this global market that it's been very hard for countries to diversify away from Russia. Now, a big question to me going forward is, Russia has been attractive to non-Western countries because of the model that it uses. It's called the BOO, Build, Own, Operate. So Russia has offered very attractive financial terms to Turkey, for example, or to Egypt for the El Dabaa plant. Will the Russian state be able to do this over the medium to long term going forward? I don't have a firm answer to this, but I think that's sort of a space to watch. In the arms sales, again, as I already mentioned yesterday, the Russian defense industry actually took a dent. I mean, the defense sector is one of the main drivers of the Russian economy today. It's the single largest area of spending budgeted for 2023. According to the Russian state, production and supply of weapons has increased, I think, 7-fold since February of last year. And it's not just the military-industrial complex that is fulfilling those needs, but also civilian factories that have pivoted towards military production. But they're producing for domestic needs. The arms exports have taken a dent. If you look at the latest SIPRI report of March of this year, you see that, Russia still accounts for 16% of global arms exports in the 5-year period between 2018 and 2022. But that's already down from the previous 5-year period. India, China, and Egypt were among the main buyers of Russian arms. But there's a lower volume now of pending deliveries in 2023. Analysts are trying to make sense of the drivers here. There's one argument that it is the threat of US sanctions, of CAATSA sanctions, that is dissuading customers to turn towards Russia. And there's perhaps some evidence, anecdotal, that that's true. So there's the argument that the Philippines, for example, have canceled orders with Russia because of the threat of sanctions. But then it's also the carrot. It's the US or Western countries actually offering these countries alternatives, which is not exactly unimportant. But there's also the argument about the decreased appeal of Russian weapons, given how some of these systems have performed in the war in Ukraine, or also customers basically knowing, well, if we enter into a deal, this is not just the one-off buy, but Russia also needs to be able to service these systems, provide spare parts, and all of this over a longer period. And so a decreased appeal, perhaps, of Russian weapons in that regard. But one shouldn't over-exaggerate this trend either. I mean, to India, Russia is still the main arms supplier. And is still providing a lot of engineering support and spare parts. But there are those who are forecasting that Russia, if things continue as they are, stands to lose its position as the second largest arms exporter in the world over the next few years, and probably go to place 4 or 5 in the chain. The next category is what one could call the roundabout trade, or that's how the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development has called this. So intermediated trade into Russia through third countries. And that's, of course, been a great concern from a Western perspective in terms of dual-use goods being still shipped into Russia in circumvention of sanctions and export controls. Here, it's especially Turkey that has emerged as a transshipment hub for deliveries of tech goods, for instance. It's been said that drone parts from China made their way through Turkey to Russia. microchips, US origin microchips, and I think the US government has already lobbied Ankara quite extensively to make sure that that practice is stopped, but I think it's still continuing and there's loopholes that are being exploited. But I think Central Asia and South Caucasus countries are also playing a certain role in the roundabout trade. The next category I want to speak about a little more is where Russia still is able to procure weapons on the international market. So there's some evidence that Russia bought artillery shells from North Korea, and also some evidence that Russia tried to buy weapons from countries like Egypt or South Africa. At least that's what the leaked US intelligence documents earlier this year indicated, that there was an attempt to buy weapons from Egypt. There was this incident with the Lady R, this cargo ship that was docked at a port in South Africa that was allegedly carrying military cargo destined for Russia. That's what the US ambassador to South Africa alleged. And I think there's still an ongoing investigation into that issue, though South Africa has denied that. But I think the most important foreign source of weaponry for Russia has been Iran. I spoke about this a little bit yesterday, but Russia has significantly procured Shahed drones from Iran since last summer. They started to appear on the battlefield in Ukraine last fall, predominantly used against Ukrainian civilian infrastructure and energy infrastructure, though also increasingly against some military targets. The United States has also said that Iranian personnel has been present in Crimea on the ground to assist Russia, and that a drone factory is being built with Iranian assistance in the Tatarstan region to ensure that Russia has this constant supply of Shahed drones. These systems have been, from sort of what we know from open source investigations, been delivered either by ship through the Caspian Sea or through state airlines. And again, without sort of going too much into detail here, why did Russia do this? This was sort of an unprecedented decision. The Russians bought commercial drones from China, but they signaled no intent before this war to buy combat drones from Iran. It's really to do with the state of the Russian drone industry, which was in development in the years prior to this war, but really not fast enough and not able to produce these kinds of systems at low cost and at massive scale. So the Russians had deployed their own drones for ISR, for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance in Ukraine, but even there they were facing shortages, which is why they bought commercial drones from China. And you actually even have volunteer groups inside of Russia, what's this called, crowdfunding, to send these drones to the front. For combat drones, they chose to turn to Iran. The Shahed drones, they are tested on the battlefield because they've been used in the Middle East extensively. They can be produced at scale relatively cheaply by the Iranians. Per some estimates, one Shahed drone costs $20,000. And they're already relatively resilient to Western sanctions because Iran has been sanctioned by the West for a long time, and yet Iran is able to produce these systems. They also offer the sort of suitable ranges for the Russian military. They're able to fly low and therefore pose a headache to Ukrainian air defense. So this is why this is happening. The big question going forward is what more might we see? And the big concern over the last 6 months or more has been that Russia would procure ballistic missiles from Iran. Now that hasn't happened. Analysts have different explanations as to why not. Some say that the Russians decided, not to go there because they were worried that in return the West would supply Ukraine with long-range rocketry that also could strike into Russia, and they were nervous about that. Then there's the argument that Iran and Russia want to wait until October of this year. In October of this year, a specific provision under UN Security Council Resolution 2231, which is the resolution that endorsed the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, is expiring. And once that resolution expires, Iran is allowed to export systems that it's not allowed to export currently. Now, interestingly, over the last 2 weeks, there's been some reporting in the media that Western states want to prevent this provision from lapsing because they're concerned that the Iranians will export missiles. Then the big question is, if they do that, that's basically Europe or Western states going into non-compliance with the nuclear deal. Some argue, well, it's already dead anyway, so what does it matter? But the question is how Iran would respond to that, and whether we might see these systems, appearing on the battlefield in Ukraine. I think it's very much an open question. There are arguments to be made for and against why that might happen. The next category I quickly want to mention is sort of in the realm of payment infrastructure. So, the Mir payment system, the Russian Mir payment system, which is a card payment system for electronic fund transfers that was established by the Central Bank of Russia actually already a few years ago. I think it was adopted in May 2017. Russia has quite aggressively tried to expand that in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine. It's courted many countries. But then the U.S. Treasury threatened foreign banks to impose secondary sanctions if they serve as Mir cards. And so some countries walked away from that again. Turkey is perhaps the most important case, which used Mir at some point and then stopped it. And now I think in April, Russia's central bank said that globally only 9 countries are accepting the Mir payment cards, among them countries like Belarus, Cuba, and Venezuela. But in this category of payment infrastructure, I think there's also been some attempt by Russia to de-dollarize its trade. There's some talk about a BRICS common currency that's supposedly to be developed, which I think at this stage is more talk than actually anything happening. When the Chinese president visited Moscow in March, Putin said that Russia is ready to use the Chinese currency in its trade with third countries in Asia, Africa and Latin America, and sort of to reduce quote-unquote unfriendly currencies in its own trade. So there are efforts underway with this, but the record's very much mixed in terms of how that's going for Russia. So for example, in the spring, there were negotiations between Russia and India to settle their trade in rupees, and that fell apart over various disagreements. And then perhaps 2 more categories on the economic side that I want to mention here, perhaps, which are not on the slide, are, I guess, the grain deal and the extent to which that gives Russia leverage. That's another sort of economic factor. We have the Black Sea Grain Initiative since last summer, which was worked out with the participation of Russia, Ukraine, Turkey, and the UN. And I think at this point, this is a deal that always runs for a few months, and Russia routinely threatens to disrupt it because it says it's not benefiting under the deal, that its own fertilizer products are not being exported. And at the same time, Russia is engaging in this messaging towards global South countries, for instance, to Africa, saying, well, if the deal collapses, we will give grain to Africa for free. Whether that would actually happen is a different question. But if you talk with people from Africa, for example, I talked to an Egyptian expert quite recently, and he said to me, well, for us in Egypt, we're so dependent on Russian grain still. It's one of the main reasons why we cannot afford to antagonize Russia. It's really the agricultural products that are most significant for us. So it remains, I think, a point of leverage. Though I'd be very curious to hear your views on this later as the grain expert in the room. And then perhaps also on the negative side, these are kind of forms of adaptation that have allowed Russia to stay afloat. But of course, there's also lots of negative things to be said on the economic side, perhaps most notably a lack of investment in the Russian economy and Western businesses leaving, but then perhaps also the brain drain of educated Russians, young Russians leaving the country to come here, Istanbul, Central Asian countries. I don't have the most up-to-date statistics on this, but there's sort of a question, well, what does that mean for the Russian economy over the medium to long term, that these people have left and might not be coming back? Let's go into the next category, the war of narratives. So I'll just say here that some of Russia's messaging about international order, about global politics, again, I think there's a lot of continuation here. I mean, Russia has sort of expressed a grievance with what it calls the quote-unquote rules-based international order over many years in international institutions, arguing that, well, it's the United States and Western countries that are making the rules and trying to impose the rules on others, whereas Russia stands for the implementation actually of international law, for true multipolarity. So we see still a lot of that in Russian messaging. I think we also see, certainly towards, again, the global south, the war that is now happening against Ukraine being couched as at once defensive, but also preventive and anti-colonial. So Russia had to act because otherwise a regime taken over by Nazis trying to, basically a sort of forward post used to dismember Russia would be installed in Ukraine. So Russia had to act. Russia also casts itself as leading perhaps an what it calls anti-neocolonial struggle. So if Russia is subdued in Ukraine, then other countries would become victim of the US's continued attempt to prevail in its global hegemony. Other countries would be turned against next. I looked at the Russian foreign policy concept, the new one that came out now, and I noticed that the term colonial or neocolonial is mentioned 6 times, and in the 2016 concept, 0. So this is now very sort of aggressively, I think, part of the Russian narrative. I was in a discussion hosted on Zoom by a Russian think tank a few months ago. This was right after the ICC issued the arrest warrant against Putin. And this was a webinar on Russia-Africa relations. And the Russian speakers in this webinar were making the case to their African colleagues that the ICC is actually a neocolonial instrument that is again used by the West now to harm quote-unquote non-friendly countries. And the argument that was basically made at this webinar is that Russia should work more forcefully, also in light of the Russia-Africa summit that is hosted in St. Petersburg this month, to get other African countries to leave the ICC. Again, sort of this anti-neocolonial slant was there. In terms of the messengers that are sort of making Russia's case abroad, RT, I'm just taking one example here. RT was shut down in a lot of Western countries when the war broke out last year. In the United States and several Western European countries. And it's since expanded into new geographies, though, of course, RT, for example, in the Middle East was already very much present for many years. But now, last year, it launched RT Hindi and RT Balkan. And it also fostered new partnerships with media outlets in Africa, for example, the Afrique Media, for example. I think, again, this need to spread Russia's point of view has been accorded elevated importance in the foreign policy concept, the new one, where it says, quote unquote, that it is paramount that Russia consolidates its position in the international information space. Now I want to say just a few words about how that resonates in the global south, because I think, first of all, we have to ask if global south countries, and of course the global south is not a monolith, and people don't particularly like the term either. We could also say non-Western countries. But to what extent are their views on this war and on Russia a product of Russia's information statecraft, and because they believe in Russia's narratives, versus actually just interests that exist in these countries? I think that can be very hard to decipher. But I'll just tell you from my own research and from speaking with people from various global south countries, what are the kinds of layers that I've discerned in how they view what is happening in the world today and with this war. I think the first layer is that the way Russia frames this war partially resonates. That there's a NATO or Western complicity in causing this war. But actually there's 2 versions of this, and they're totally diametrically opposed. You do find those who say that Russia was provoked, that NATO expansion, Western policy provoked Russia into taking the step. But then there's also those who argue, and I've heard that argument in Saudi Arabia, I've heard it in Turkey, well, if the West had acted properly, more forcefully against Russian aggression in years prior, after the annexation of Crimea and the war in Syria, for example, then this would not have happened. Then Russia would have been deterred. So it was NATO weakness in years prior, as opposed to NATO aggression, that led Russia to take this step. So that's kind of interesting. I think, though, importantly, as the West has stepped up its own support for Ukraine over the last 16 months, this war is perceived more and more as a Russia-NATO proxy war, rather than a Russia-Ukraine war. Another layer, which is very powerful, and it has different manifestations in different parts of the world, is that this is not our war and we have our own problems. We have no doubt that Russia violated international law by launching this war, but it is not our war. We have wars in the Middle East, and then there's this grievance over perceptions of Western hypocrisy and double standards in terms of how they responded to the war. This idea that, I'm German, for example, of course, a lot of Ukrainian refugees came to Germany. Oh, the way that we accepted them was totally different from how we accepted Syrian refugees who came a few years ago. This just shows that we care about our own neighborhood and not about the rest of the world. And this idea that Europe has turned into a single issue actor. When diplomats meet with diplomats from Latin America or Africa, all they want to talk about is the war in Ukraine, is something that is also being said, and that causes a lot of frustrations. And then I think there's another layer, which is, regardless of how other states might view this war, and this is something that, for example, is particularly important in the Middle East, but I'm sure it would apply to parts of Asia and Latin America as well, is, the world is changing. Relatively speaking, the United States and the West are in decline. China is on the upswing. Russia is still there. We need to just hedge our bets. We cannot afford to antagonize other major powers, and especially given the position that China has staked out on this war, we cannot go all in with the West. It's not in our national interest to do so. I will just sort of quickly say anecdotally that I was at the conference in Tallinn, Estonia, a few weeks ago at the Lennart Meri conference, and Fiona Hill, who you might all know who she is, gave the keynote speech, and she said that what the global South was now doing, or how it was looking at this war in Ukraine, it was engaging in a quote-unquote proxy rebellion against US hegemony. It was jumping on the Russian bandwagon to also push back against the US. And you could just note that a lot of Western experts in the room found this concept very appealing, catchy. And then when people from global South countries actually took the stage, they were quite upset, because they said, why are you again framing this as being about you, as we are engaging in a proxy rebellion against US hegemony? Not everything is about the US. We are just taking care of our own interests. So with them, this concept really didn't resonate. And I think that was quite telling. The next part of the lecture I will keep very short, because this is basically what we talked about yesterday. I think it's interesting and useful to look at how Russia has tried to adapt its presence in theaters beyond Ukraine in order to stay influential. Yesterday I was making the argument to you that, of course, the presence in Syria is absolutely vital for Russia, I think. If you speak with Russian experts and you sort of say, well, what if things go sort of really, really badly in Ukraine? Would you withdraw from Syria? And the argument that you would hear is that, well, no, the naval presence at the port of Tartus and the airbase in Hmeimim, we really got to keep this, because it's an important base from which to project power into the region. And so what you've seen in Syria over the last year, I argued yesterday, is the sort of awkward mix between risk aversion, Russia not wanting to rock the boat too much, especially vis-a-vis Turkey, supporting the continuation of cross-border aid into the northwest of the country, but more recently also greater adventurism, pushing back against US forces in northeast Syria, especially in recent months, as Ukraine's counteroffensive is underway. Wagner's presence in Africa had not suffered all that much over the first 16 months of this war. There were some relocations from some African locations to Ukraine, from all we know, but actually quite an aggressive push to stay in Africa. And if you look at Prigozhin's narrative over his messaging since the beginning of the Ukraine war and his growing prominence in the Russian information space, he even said a few times that he has ambitions to grow the Africa business. Of course, the big question now is what will happen after the failed mutiny and whether Wagner will be able to keep its business, or how that's going to be worked out with the Russian state and the Russian Minister of Defense. And there's, analysts have different views, and I think it's very much an open question at the moment. But so far we have not seen any major collapse. And I think there was this politician in the Central African Republic who was asked about this. And he, I think, sort of said, well, if they're not sending Wagners anymore from Russia, we'll take the Mozarts or Beethovens, to sort of imply, we want to keep working with Russians. We don't really care which group it is. And of course, there are other Russian PMCs that have sprung up. I think this is, if we want to talk about genuine adaptation and what's really new in Russian statecraft, the normalization and proliferation of mercenary activity, I think, is sort of at the top of the list. And it's very interesting to analyze where that's going. And of course, now with the mutiny and an attempt by the Russian state to, a realization that perhaps these entities became too unwieldy and that they need to be reined in, I think it's going to be fascinating to watch how that's going to play out. In the South Caucasus, I sort of suggested that, of course, Russia has been less muscular, less proactive. Last year in September, with the Azerbaijani incursion into Armenia proper, and great frustration on the Armenian side with the CSTO and its failure to mitigate against that. And Russia sort of appears to keep its presence here, but is also not proactively really putting anything forward against Turkey and Azerbaijan. I think, to me, the loss of Russian leverage vis-a-vis both Iran and Turkey is one of the, major repercussions so far of this war. Greater Russian dependence on both countries for different reasons: on Iran for the drones, on Turkey for mostly economic lifelines. And that has implications, across the region. And then there's China's growing role in the Middle East. China was never really a military actor in the Middle East, not even so much a political actor. It was mostly an economic player. And now you see them making inroads, mediating between Saudi Arabia and Iran, the recent normalization, now saying we want to mediate Israel-Palestine, which is unprecedented for the Chinese. And some of those theaters are sort of historically Russian playing fields. And so there's already been a debate, what does Russia make of this more emboldened Chinese role? And there's been some Russian analysts writing that that won't please the Kremlin. And then there's others who actually argue, well, at this point in time, anything that weakens the US influence in these regions is welcome from a Russian perspective. And in any case, they're not yet stepping on each other's toes. And so I think that's something also to watch. Okay, let's go to multilateral diplomacy, which is an interesting area to watch. And I want to sort of start by saying that what you see now playing out in multilateral institutions, and I'm most familiar with those that are dealing with nuclear issues, with nuclear non-proliferation or arms control, the grievances are not new. And I want to do like a quick diversion, a quick case study to show you where maybe Russia, Western grievance and acrimony in a multilateral institution has played out particularly forcefully for years before this war. And that's the OPCW in The Hague, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. So very, very quick background. Russia and Western countries actually cooperated in 2013, 2014 on the chemical disarmament of Syria. There was a Security Council resolution and a deal at the OPCW, and then a joint mission, that was actually working on the ground in Syria together in the winter 2013, spring 2014. So when the annexation of Crimea happened and really Russian-Western relations went south, and there were people in the Obama administration who wanted all kinds of cooperation with Russia to stop, this deal was being insulated. It was already in motion, and people on both sides said it's important to continue this cooperation. But then from 2014 onwards, you really have this downward slide at the OPCW between Russia and Western countries. I'll quickly sort of explain what happened. There were questions early on about whether the Syrians had actually declared all of their chemical weapons. And so a team was set up in agreement with the Syrian government, the DAT, to look into that. And then as early as 2014, there were allegations that Syria continued to use chemical weapons. And again, a team was set up to look into it, the fact-finding mission, which didn't have the mandate to attribute responsibility for chemical use. So it was allowed to say whether chemical weapons had been used, but not who had used them. So that, for that purpose, the JIM was set in place a year later, endorsed by a Security Council resolution. August 2015, Russia consents on the UN Security Council. Beware, this is 1 month before Russia militarily intervenes in the conflict in Syria. And so these things are operating, but once the JIM finds both the Islamic State and the Syrian government responsible for chemical weapons use, says this is what the Syrians did, now let's move to the UN Security Council to, establish consequences. Russia vetoed the extension of the mechanism, and the JIM was dead. Then Western states at the OPCW were like, okay, well, we're blocked now. What are we going to do? UN Security Council is blocked. Our mechanisms are blocked. We're not functioning. Let's put in place another mechanism, the IIT. And that was decided by a majority decision at the OPCW States Party conference. Now, why do all these things matter? I don't want to get sort of too nitty-gritty procedural, but basically, Russia has argued, first of all, that the OPCW has done sloppy work, that this FFM, it was biased in the composition of the inspectors, it didn't question witnesses properly. So Russia took sort of an aggressive stance on the unprofessionalism of this multilateral organization. On the IIT, Russia said, hang on a minute, this is a multilateral institution that's supposed to operate by consensus. We're making decisions on substance by consensus. Now you coming and making a vote with majority to put in place this mechanism, this IIT? No, we're not supporting it. We're not giving money for the budget for it. We're not recognizing it. It also has an illegal mandate because you cannot give within the OPCW the mandate to establish the responsibility for chemical use to the technical secretariat. This is the prerogative of the UN Security Council, on which we have a veto right. Now, the reason I'm saying this is because these procedural quarrels that have played out in this multilateral institution and have basically completely paralyzed it and led to this standstill and fragmentation, where basically now Western states are doing their thing at the OPCW. And of course, it's all been exacerbated by the poisoning of Skripal and Navalny and how that's played out procedurally. You're now seeing that kind of procedural quarrel, Russia on the one hand and Western states on the others, both arguing within a legal framework of a multilateral institution. You see that play out elsewhere since the invasion of Ukraine. So before the invasion of Ukraine, it was the OPCW. Now it's also happening more at the IAEA. Last September, where things had been much more constructive in years prior. The NPT review conference of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty didn't manage to agree on a consensus document last summer, though that's not unprecedented. My broader point here is that in multilateral institutions, at least those that deal with WMD, we've gone kind of from already a very rocky place for years to a bad place. And the question is, what will happen with these multilateral institutions going forward? What else is happening in multilateral diplomacy? I put there goodbye Geneva, because Russia, after the invasion of Ukraine, also stopped being willing to come to Geneva to negotiate on various issues. To give you an example, the US-Russian Bilateral Consultative Commission on the New START Treaty used to meet in Geneva. The Syrian Constitutional Committee used to meet in Geneva. Talks on the South Caucasus were sometimes convened in Geneva. After last spring, Russia basically said, well, because of the unfriendly actions of the Swiss government against us, Russia, we're no longer meeting in these locations. If you want to meet in Cairo or in Abu Dhabi, that's fine. We will meet with Western counterparts there. And of course, we talked about this yesterday already, Turkey stepped up as an intermediary, partially because of this. But Geneva has really suffered. Now I think Russia is slowly coming back for some issues to meet in Geneva. But that's been another consequence. The UN Security Council, I think, was more functional last year than many had sort of anticipated. There was still consensus on a number of issues: Haiti, a statement on the Taliban in Afghanistan, the extension of some peacekeeping missions, but overall more Russian vetoes and abstentions than in years prior. So that's a sort of consequence at the UN Security Council. And then you have, I think, Russia, together with China, even more aggressively trying to push for alternative fora. With the BRICS, there's lots of interesting things going on, inviting other countries to either join the BRICS or become observers. I've already mentioned the efforts to establish a joint currency. They're meeting more frequently, same thing with the SCO. So this idea to establish alternative fora with countries that are friendly to us and that want to do business with us. Now, I think the problem here is, I think we will probably see this fragmentation across these legacy institutions continue. Small states don't actually want to see this happen. They're pretty frustrated. They want the UN to be operational because all these small countries, they have an equal vote. They have they're an equal in these big institutions. They want to use the IAEA, for example, to get their own interests taken care of. And they're really frustrated by this great power acrimony that is now affecting all this routine work in these institutions. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see how that is going to continue to play out. And the last point I wanted to make in this presentation is what is happening in Russia's activities and its positioning vis-a-vis Western countries. And I think, and I'm just putting here what I see as really the most important changes since February last year. And the first I call the end of compartmentalization. So the idea that you have certain issues that you insulate from the broader conflict. Now, to be fair, Russia didn't start this. It was Western countries that stopped compartmentalizing cooperation with Russia after 2014. Russia was kicked out of the G8. The US stopped joint cooperation with Russia on a range of issues: space exploration, missile defense, Afghanistan, law enforcement, basically saying we cannot do this with Russia now after its aggressive policy. And now Russia is basically adopting the same stance on issues that were still considered sacrosanct: nuclear arms control and non-proliferation. So I don't want to go too much into detail, but I mentioned yesterday the New START Treaty, which is now completely affected by this situation. It wasn't from the beginning. I mean, last year in April, Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov said, "We do not believe that the situation around Ukraine is relevant to the implementation of New START." So there was still some hope that inspections under the treaty, which had been suspended due to the COVID pandemic, could be somehow resumed. Then last summer, Russia was already signaling that that wasn't going to happen. Then the Bilateral Consultative Commission was finally supposed to meet, not in Geneva, but in Cairo. Last minute, Russian diplomats said, "We cannot come." The meeting is postponed. And then through the winter, it transpired that it wasn't going to be rescheduled. And then in the spring, Russia suspended its participation in the New START Treaty. The US has really tried to see whether they can still talk with Russia on nuclear arms control. Jake Sullivan just a few weeks ago said in a speech at the Arms Control Association, "We are willing to talk with Russia on a post-2026 framework for New START without preconditions." So the US actually, last summer, it was signaling that there needed to be some sort of Russian goodwill, and everyone was debating, what does that mean? What has to happen in Ukraine for the US to be willing to talk to Russia about nuclear arms control? The US appears to have dropped that. They're now saying without precondition, but Russia is saying, while you are engaging in a quote-unquote strategic defeat of us, which Russians take to mean you want to dismember the country and remove it as an independent entity in international politics. That's how Russia chooses to read strategic defeat. We're not talking to you about nuclear arms control. And Putin, I think, also made this clear at the St. Petersburg International Forum. So nuclear arms control is completely affected by this. Nuclear non-proliferation, people have different views about this. I have argued that Russia is also no longer compartmentalizing that. Given its changed position on the Iran nuclear deal, on the JCPOA, I think Russia has become less helpful on efforts to restore that. Others disagree with me, but there's even Russian experts who write openly that in this era of confrontation with the United States, it's not in Russia's interest to support US non-proliferation objectives with regards to North Korea and Iran. That's something that Dmitry Trenin, for example, has written. And then in terms of no more business as usual, there's the whole debate about Russia's, what people call Russia's nuclear saber rattling, and whether the Russian rhetoric on nuclear escalation risks has remained within the bounds of Russian declaratory policy, just deterring NATO, deterring an active entry into this war. Some people out there argue that this is deterrence at work. This is nothing more than that. But of course, more recently, you have also had Russian scholars actually arguing for preemptive nuclear use against European countries. And so that doesn't sound so much like just deterrence anymore. And the purpose of that, perhaps not just being deterring a direct entry of NATO into the conflict, but of course also to dissuade Western countries from continuing to support Ukraine. So I think there's that domain as well. I just want to end by offering a few thoughts. And again, as I said, this is thoughts in progress, work in progress. When I think about what has been acceleration of an extant strategy and what has been adaptation, I think there has been a lot of continuation, but just doubling down, doing more of the same, but sort of harder. The genuine adaptation, I think, has been in the economic sphere. I think the Russian economic adaptation has been quite something. I mentioned the PMCs, and I think things like procuring drones from Iran, that was not foreseen, that was genuinely forced by circumstance and has been adaptation. Who are the agents of adaptation? Now, my own take on this is that, of course, all of this is happening because of the decision of the Russian president to launch the invasion of Ukraine. But he's not the only agent on the Russian side steering adaptation. Largely, from what we understand, the economic adaptation is left to the technocrats. The central bank has played a really important role, other economic agents. Sometimes you can infer from who you're dealing with how important an issue is to Russia. So it was, for example, noted that the delegation that ended up being sent to the NPT review conference last summer in New York was really low level. Initially, a deputy foreign minister was supposed to come, and then they sent a sort of no-name delegation, and people took that to mean, well, Russia is not according importance or priority to this issue right now. And then you have agents like Prigozhin, who was afforded a lot of leeway until very recently. So I think it's interesting to look at the different agents on the Russian side. There's been successes on the Russian side in this, and there's new vulnerabilities. In terms of vulnerabilities, I'll sort of say, for me, the two main ones are the reduced leverage over Iran and Turkey and the growing dependence of China, and how that is going to play out and have repercussions in all these areas we discussed today, economically, militarily, international institutions, where Russia is also perhaps more taking China's position on certain issues than it did before the war is going to be very interesting. And then the question of, well, what does this all mean for Russia as a global actor going forward? First of all, the trajectory that's now in motion, the adaptation and acceleration, to what extent does it depend solely on even Vladimir Putin staying in power? If he were to leave the scene tomorrow, depending on who takes over, would Russia continue on this path, or what would it take for some of these things to be reversed? Some of the new economic interdependencies and dependencies of the Russian state, how easily could they be undone after some period of time? And then I took a quote from a piece that you wrote with Masha Lipman recently, because I think that's also really interesting to discuss. The cultural dimension. You've said that the weak link here for Putin is cultural, because for 300 years, Russia's emulation and immersion in Western culture was so integral to its own evolution, and China and the so-called global South cannot replace Europe as a model for Russia's culture. So I suppose there's only Russia's new relations with non-Western countries can only go so far. And that's, I think, a question. So I'm just giving you an interesting statistic here. Between February 2022 and March of this year, Putin had 232 engagements with non-Western leaders over the phone and in actual meetings. 232 engagements in total, 83% of which were with non-Western countries. For Lavrov, the ratio of engagement with foreign ministers and other diplomats from non-Western countries was 96%. So this forever war both necessitates but also allows for a global realignment, it seems to me. And the robustness of that realignment and the depth of that realignment, I think, is sort of an open question and one that very much interests me. And I'll be curious to hear your thoughts about it. I'll end here.